everybody. I'm alive and I'm awake as well. This is your host, Chuck Horton. Oh, we got an incoming call already. I think this is our guest tonight. Hang on while I answer the phone. And I don't want to answer the phone. I want to add it to the call, if I remember correctly. And is this Eric?
It is, Eric, yes.
All right. You sound great, Eric. Better than me. I'm going to have to mute my mic so I don't clear my... Okay. So, anyway, continuing with my introduction of myself, I am coming to you live from dark Southern Oregon, and it's dark just because the sun went down. But it's been quite stormy and cloudy, and it's been kind of today was very windy. And so we're in not in our usual sunny, peaceful, still air, beautiful climate setting here. It's a little bit different. But anyway.
Yeah, it's all horrible here, so don't come here.
Yeah. It's just horrible today. Usually it's really paradise. But anyway, tonight we have a great show lined up for you. Don't take this awkward beginning as any sense that we have something all planned and scripted out, and I think it's going to be a really great show. We have a lot of things have been happening economically in the United States since the first of the year. Actually, they started probably back in October, November, but they weren't really kind of covered up by all the stuff that was going on during the holiday season. And there were other headlines that people chose to put in the news and everything. And we mentioned a few things from time to time on our Facebook page, but once all the big headlines kind of died away, it became really apparent that things were much worse than I thought even. It was, but they may not be as bad as I think they could be, and it may not end up that way. So I decided I needed to get somebody who really has their finger on the pulse of the financial markets rather than just relying on my gut feelings, because they're not always 100% correct. So I invited Eric on the show, Eric Dubin, and he's from the News Doctors, and he is just an awesome resource for us here on Double Cross Radio. He lives locally, and I see him from time to time, and he's always got good information. He's really well connected, and he's had a really good career in financial matters. Are you an investment analyst or some kind of investment licensee or something like that?
No. Once upon a time in a former life, in the 1990s, I basically responded to the calling of the technology boom and got very, very interested in finance. And I, mid-90s or so, was working with Microsoft to help them launch the portal that they named Investor.com, which ultimately became MSN Money. And we did a lot of things in that context, as the building out model portfolio for people to look at, amongst other analysts and hedge fund managers and people of that nature. So that's basically the roots of where my first experiences in the financial community extend. I've always been on what's called the buy side community, and that is that in advising folks about what are in fact sound investments and whatnot, rather than working within the actual institutions of brokerage houses and whatnot, and they call that the quote-unquote sell side. So the marketing terms suggest exactly what you would expect them to mean.
Okay, well, tonight
I've gotten into precious metals, actually. I mean, the 2000 crash, all of the changes that had happened at that time, and living through that bubble was kind of like a baptism of fire. And
yeah.
It taught me a lot to understand the nature of bubbles and the cycles that we go through, and we're going to talk a lot about that today.
Yeah, so anyway, we're going to continue on here. I got to make sure you're being heard okay in chat. I got to check with chat to make sure we're being heard, I should say. I have a warning thing on the bottom of my screen here. It says you aren't. So let's just check with that.
It's the wonders of live radio. You
Yeah,
guys
it is.
Move to a podcast format.
Okay, I'm going to make sure everybody can hear you. They're pretty attentive, and hopefully they'll give us a quick answer here. We'll continue as if they can. The little warning sign came back. Oh, I don't know. Maybe you can.
The people are.
Well, I think it's okay.
So we can just continue on, and
yeah, we'll continue on. I'm recording this, so we'll have a podcast if nothing else. Anyway,
that sounds great.
I started off actually just about the time I was finishing up my research for last week's show. I started reading some economic stuff just because that's kind of my hobby, and I realized that, man, a lot of stuff was kind of piling up on the negative side of the ledger in terms of news. I mean, it was just bad news, bad news, bad news, bad news, and I thought, wow, this is kind of unusual. We're not hearing very much of this on the mainstream news cycle, and so I thought, in order to kind of line this up for our listeners, we'd start off with just kind of a basic description of the stock market. Traditionally, stocks are supposed to represent kind of a picture of the prosperity, either good or bad, of the nation. It's supposed to be, they're supposed to be valued by the profit that the businesses they represent belong to, or the profit from those businesses anyway. And that's how it was supposed to work, and it worked that way for a long time. And I remember when I was in college in the 70s, it was still working that way. It doesn't seem to always work that way today, however. So you knowing more about this than I thought I'd let you talk a little bit about this.
Well, you know, when anyone tunes into the nightly news or what have you, they'll see the report about the economy, and they'll always report about what the Dow Jones Industrial Average did, and, you know, that's only 30 stocks, but, you know, it's the kind of barometer that people talk a lot about in general terms as to whether or not, you know, the beating heart of the American economy is doing okay. And if you have a big old crash or downturn and people are losing money and whatnot, it's really hard to maintain confidence within the system and the overall sentiment within our economy, which is, you know, 65% plus based on consumption. You know, as soon as you start seeing people get really nervous about economic conditions, they pull in the horns and they get more conservative with their spending. They try to pay down a little bit of debt. So the powers that be love to pay attention a lot to the stock market, because it's something that, quite literally, even in terms of, you know, the consumer confidence surveys like the University of Michigan and all that, they're part of the components of getting a beat on how people think and feel in the economy is literally inputting data of the closing of the stock market. And I think they use the S&P 500. I don't remember what it is, but and it just goes to show that the sense that as the stock market goes the U.S. economy is something that's just part of our culture. And, you know, the other thing, too, now that we have so much distortions going on with so much money and so much credit being created, it's not money, as your audience knows, because you talk about this a lot, it ends up flowing first to financial markets, and it ends up distorting the perceptions of what's going on. And you don't even need to take my word for it. You could listen to the words of people like Dallas Fed Reserve President Stanley Fish. No, sorry, I always forget his name. But anyway, he's the former. I'm sorry. Say it again.
We'll just call him Mr. Fisher.
It's not Fisher, actually. I was mixing it up with Stanley Fisher, who's the president currently sitting as the board in the New York Fed. The person I had in mind is actually probably fairly described as having the most Austrian school of economic tendencies that anyone has had who has served in the equivalently powerful position as he did back, I think his term ended in December when he was the president of the Dallas Fed. But last month, he came out and basically said that because of all of the monetary stimulus that the central banks around the world and Federal Reserve has been the lead Pied Piper in this effort. Because of that monetary stimulus, basically the pushing up of asset prices in the stock markets and supporting the bond market and all of these efforts that they attempted to manifest through these financial assets were all, and frankly, he just flat out admits it, stealing future demand. Because, when you dump in an enormous amount of stimulus into an economy, it pulls up the asset prices, and they're basically borrowing from the future. And the way they attempt to justify this or try to use the tool is essentially trying to make the asset prices of the wealthy, the wealth effect, elevate the economy. And they admit this. This is, something they freely speak about when they're usually out of office, as opposed to, sitting with the cameras rolling and they're doing their public relations shtick that central bankers do.
And this wasn't one of the original mandates for the Federal Reserve taking care of the economy. They were supposed to be the lender of last resort to keep the banking system stable and let the free market operate. At least that's what it said. But I guess they figured that they weren't a big enough player, and they wanted to take more responsibility on, so people would have to bow down to them or something. But it certainly is today, whether that's their original charter or not. That's what they do now.
Yeah, and the financial crash happened, and by 2008, October, November or so, we witnessed basically the near shutdown of the entire financial system. We were literally within hours where the overnight credit market had frozen up and everything was freezing. And this was the same period of time where, at the time, Treasury Secretary Paulson was going to high members of Congress and basically telling them that if you don't approve these bailouts in the form of TARF and TALF and all that stuff, that we're going to have martial law. Potential revolution could even happen. And so we had the conditions set up for what in total, now as we understand from the partial audit that Ron Paul was successfully able to get through, $16.9 trillion worth of backstops and credit and various other schemes to reflate the financial markets and to save the banking industry. The banking industry, I should back up a little bit, and this will give a lot of context to people when it comes to understanding the stock market and how you opened up the conversation. In the last 15 some odd years, we've gone through these gigantic cycles of busting and then needing some kind of a reflation to save the economy. And so in March 2000, the NASDAQ peaked, and 2 years later, everyone looked around and said, oh my gosh, we just had a huge bear market. and how did they fix the problem? Quote unquote fix, basically kick the can down the road. They created the real estate bubble. The real estate bubble crashed, took down the financial system in turn, and what did we have in its place? This $16.9 trillion and more. And now we're at a stage where the system basically can't sustain another one of these round-trip cycles, and things have to change. And this isn't just my opinion. You can look at, once again, people who are no longer in the top ranks of power in central banks and whatnot. Once they leave office, they speak more freely. And the former chief economist of the Bank of International Settlements recently said that the financial system is so unstable with levels of debt so intense that we might even have to consider the notion of jubilee. And this is, somebody who's at the core of the international financial system saying things that would, send most central bankers' hair on fire.
Yeah, this is for those of you who are the avid followers of Jeff Berwick. He talks about that frequently. I'm not so sure that is for real. I think it may be people trying to make things occur in those kinds of cycles behind the scenes so they can blame it on that. And kind of skate away untouched. But he tends to think it's like a natural cycle that happens. We're not cicada or whatever that insect in Pennsylvania is. We're human beings, and we're reasoning beings, and we aren't ruled by time clocks in our head that all of a sudden make us start to do irrational things, and then suddenly rationality returns and everything collapses.
The cycle stuff is a great subject to talk about, but frankly, we should probably steer away from it because to do it justice would take 20 minutes.
Yeah, it is, and I think the fact that there's so many people. When we first started this show, it was a little over 3 years ago. Nobody was talking about this. Everybody was talking about recovery. There were. I don't know. There was just a lot of other stuff going on, and
let me read you a quote from this gent because I actually just pulled it up so that I could be exact. And whom I'm speaking of is William White, who is the current Swiss-based chairman of the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, and previously he served as the chief economist for the Bank of International Settlements. And also, for context, this guy has actually said some pretty interesting things over the years. He's kind of like the former governor of the Dallas Bank Federal Reserve branch, in the sense that he's almost like a gesture, the court gesture who comes out and says what everyone else amongst his peers are afraid to say. Listen to this. This is just mind-boggling. This is a quote from Ambrose Evans Pritchard's article back on January 19th, and I know you're well familiar with that journalist. He does great work.
Yeah, I've been following him since the Clinton scandals.
That's how he got famous, and now he's ventured off into the realm of finance and does some of the best journalism in finance on the planet. So this gent had said, and I quote, "This situation is worse than in 2007. Our macroeconomic ammunition to fight downturns is essentially all used up." And skipping on, in another choice segment, he said that the debts have continued to build up over the last 8 years, and they have reached such a level in every part of the world that they have become a potent cause for mischief. It will become obvious in the next recession that many of these debts will never be serviced or repaid, and this will be unfortunate for a lot of people who think they own assets that are worth something. The only question is whether we are able to look reality in the eye and face what is coming in an orderly fashion, or whether it will be disorderly. Debt jubilees have been going on for 5,000 years, as far back as the Sumerians.
Yeah.
When you consider who is speaking, and the fact that the Bank for International Settlements is the central bank for central banks, you're talking about the core of the financial system in the West. And this guy, now that he's no longer beholden to speaking basically in compliance with what they allow their employees and so forth to say, he's speaking more truth.
Yeah, and notice he didn't just say, the debts won't be fully paid back. He said the debts won't be serviced or paid back. I mean, there will be no income from them. Period. Yeah. It's just,
and
it's
it's
kind of like a de facto bankruptcy. Just come and get me. I don't have any assets that are worth anything anymore. Whatever. I don't have anything left. And
the key thing is that he's dropping the word jubilee, which is that's a verboten word to be uttered by a central banker.
Yeah.
And what this really means, and it's so typical to see these kind of things as well when they do their powwow in Davos, Switzerland, and all the mucky mucks get there and talk about how to basically manage the world. The reality is that the people at the top recognize that what I just said before about the fact that we can't do this round trip bubble reflation after the next crash is where we are, and that changes everything.
And I don't know. There's so much going on that is really should be people should be aware of. They need to keep track of it because it's going to give them a sense of where things are today, because they're going to be different tomorrow and different next week. And they need to kind of monitor these situations. And you have to be aware that sometimes these sources of information can be they can be kind of distorted by internal mismanagement. You know, the way that they have mangled the gold price over the last 5 or 6 years. But we were talking about I just started last week's show about the Baltic Dry Index. It's an index that kind of indirectly measures how much shipping is going on in the world. That if there's a high demand for ships, then the shippers charge more money and the index goes up. If there's no demand for ships, the people would have the lowest operating costs will keep lowering their price until they can't lower it anymore. And then you can just see the price going down, and that's because there's not much demand for any shipping. And most of the world's tankers and freighters and whatever they're in port somewhere or anchored off the coast of someplace. And they're just sitting there because they can't afford to run their ships at a loss. And so there's not a lot of international trade going on because of this. There's not a lot of demand for ships to ship goods that are being produced in one place to another place where people want to buy them. The banks have kind of robbed us so much. They've taken through this debasement of currency. They've taken out so much purchasing power out of these different countries that people need pretty much all they earn to put a roof over their head, heat their home, and buy their food. And that's about all they have money for these days. That's how I see it.
And I heard about half of the show that you did last week as well, too, in your discussion about the Baltic Dry and all that. And the great thing about the Baltic Dry is that it's measuring the shipment of basic dry goods, like bulk goods, like shiploads of coal and grain, that kind of thing. And it really reflects the base level of economic activity. And a lot of people will look at that and say, well, okay, so, maybe the data isn't quite as important or signaling of value because, for example, China stockpiled a lot of copper over the last few years, so copper demand in China may be able to be tapered down a bit without actually reflecting true economic activity.
Or maybe China's going broke.
Yeah. And the reality is that we can look at a lot of different corroborating stats and series of data that are very similar that actually paint the same picture. And they all, since the data is singing roughly from the same song sheet, we can see that the picture is clear. The economy worldwide is turning down. And we can even see it in similar measures like rail freight traffic in the United States and the order level that trucking companies are expending to produce new trucks and get them online for their fleets. That's turning down. I mean, everywhere you look, the containerized shipping, which is reflection more so of the finished goods that are moving around, and that actually reflects the final demand more clearly in Europe and America, and et cetera, versus the Baltic Dry, which is more of a reflection of the raw goods that are going into the centers of manufacture. So, in China, for example, would have a pretty outsized impact on that because they're such a large manufacturer for so much of the finished goods in the world. But no matter where you look, other than the government statistics, the Baltic Dry, the containerized shipping, the rail traffic numbers, the electricity usage numbers, the amount of final demand that's being demanded by the world economy when it comes to energy, overall oil as well. They all are pointing to the same direction, and that is down. And at the same time, we still have our policymakers in the United States still able to basically spin an alternative reality. And you open up the show talking about that, how, we all remember what it's like going through December in the retail period where it's just nonstop messaging about buy, consume, everything's great. This is how you find your joy for the season. You go out and buy something.
Yeah, Yeah, and you know, like I was for years I was in the jewelry industry, and that was our time to harvest our profit for the year. But I was just shocked at how much more alcohol you sell during that season as well. It might even be close to the same kind of order of magnitude increase in that industry. It's incredible. I mean, we were broadcasting live on New Year's Eve from my store, and the phone kept ringing, and it was live radio, and it was kind of fun. It was answering phones live on the air for telling people how long we were open that night, and it was a crazy day. We for a large portion of that day, we were selling between $4,000 and $6,000 worth of alcohol per hour.
The party at Double Cross Radio.
Well, yeah, something like that, and it was so. Yeah, all that is correct. There's and most of this information, even if it is put on to a news broadcast, there's a lot of misinformation that goes out there as well. Wednesday, I was driving to work. I have to go early on Wednesday because we get our freight on that day, and so we unloaded at 7 in the morning. So I was 6 o'clock, 6:30. I'm in my car driving, and there was news at the half hour, and some girl comes on, some lady. She was a woman actually. And she's talking about the stock market's down real strong today, and this is because of declining oil prices. And I'm going, what? You know, declining oil prices should be something that's a stimulus to our economy, because that's less of our assets that's being directed towards that. And it probably is bad for the companies that are invested in shale oil mining and or the people that are have mining or oil, some kind of oil stock derivatives out there that are highly leveraged so they can increase their profit. And it's probably bad for those people.
Right there, that's exactly where you're putting your finger on the problem. And that's where this journalist or commentator or intern,
she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just reading off what the
although it's not fair to say that she's just completely pulling that out of the air, because what she is alluding to, whether she knows what it means or not is another question, but what she's alluding to is the deflationary process of the reverse of the wealth effect. I mean, recall when we were talking about the wealth effect pushing up the asset prices, and it's now reversing. And that's it. We do have an economic chain reaction that spills over into the real economy, when you'd think that everybody would be better off with lower gasoline prices because the price of oil has crashed. And in fact, it was only 6 months ago that we were constantly hearing in the news, oil is beginning to fall down, and as it continues to fall down, in which it did, it's basically a big old tax cut for the American consumer, and it gets back to that, 65% plus of our gross domestic product that's entirely based on consumption and nothing else. And the problems that we are experiencing now in terms of the financial markets reflecting this hyper-growth of leverage, of ever-increasing amounts of debt in our global financial system, particularly in the West as well as with China, is that it creates, these big boom-bust cycles, and the policymakers come at the problem and try to fix a debt solvency problem when the bust happens by adding more credit to the system, which is the stimulus that they add. And they use those terms as opposed to just speaking in normal everyday parlance as saying, hey, we're going to try to fix a debt problem by adding more debt. And when you speak about it in those terms and translate it into normal English, the average person will kind of scratch their head and go, wait a minute, there's something wrong here.
Yeah, that's like an alcoholic curing his drinking problem by going on a drinking binge.
You got it. And can't get the dog to bit you to fix it. We're in a pickle now. So
yeah, back in it was about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a great video going around about the Keynes Hayek debate, and part of it they showed Keynes in this hotel room the next day. He's with an obvious hangover. He's kind of leaning over a toilet, and he turns around, picks up a bottle of 1800, and starts drinking some more. And
that's great. I missed that. That's not. You guys send a copy of that to me. Send a link.
Yeah, we'll have to repost that. It's an awesome video. It's very funny. Yeah. It's like Keynes was, Mr. Lord Keynes, and who are you, sir? Hayek, F.A. Hayek. How do you spell that?
That's great. I can share with you a really funny story, and you'll really appreciate this given your study of economics. My cousin earned his PhD in the graduating class at MIT the year after Bernanke. And it's a pretty close-knit community. And, he is not even really a Keynesian, in my opinion, but it is a reflection that, these are the kind, I can speak to the world view of the central banker perspective with a little bit of insight because I know, these inside stories that he's told me. And they really do believe that they're doing to go slightly out of the camp of central bankers and to move into the financial world of investment bankers, to quote our illustrious, the chair Lord Blankfein of Goldman Sachs. They believe they're doing God's work. They believe that what they're doing actually is truly saving the economy, saving the system. And the reality of it is that they don't understand that this bubble bust cycle has gotten to absurd levels. But, there's also that element within that community that also understands it, but just don't speak about it until they're actually outside. As that quote from the former chief economist of the Bank of International Settlements clearly shows.
Yeah, it's a lot of these guys are really smart guys too, and they have somehow in their mind they've adopted this worldview that just doesn't make any sense at a base level, and they've made up all these. I guess they're reassurances to themselves that they also don't make any sense. And it's hard for me to believe that people this smart can be so dumb about something so simple, and yet they are. So I don't know. I'm going to just demonstrate this by reading some things from, I had my arm on the pause button. Sorry about that, folks. This is some stuff from Sovereign Man blog earlier this week, and he's talking about stuff that our leaders tell us. And one of them is a quote from Paul Krugman from January of 2013, and it says Simon Black writes, "We're told that running huge budget deficits don't matter because," quote, here's the Krugman quote, "the government can print more money."
Yeah.
And as Simon goes on, because apparently there are absolutely zero consequences when the Federal Reserve conjures money out of thin air, except that there are consequences, and every dollar the Fed prints weakens its balance sheet and pushes it into insolvency or towards insolvency. And boy, when I read that, I kind of got this pit in my stomach and go, holy cow. What would happen if the Fed was insolvent? That would be pretty serious.
Krugman would come out with one of his other previous recommendations that he's made and say something along the lines of, why don't you create a 1-ounce platinum coin in the mint, toss it into the Treasury, and then the Fed would turn around and issue $1 trillion worth of new credit based on the basic fiat declaration that 1-ounce platinum coin sitting in the Treasury is worth $1 trillion, and then go out and do the biggest investment infrastructure program you can imagine and reboot the economy after the next crash. That would be, and quite literally, I fully expect those kind of policy discussions to be in our media after the next crash once again.
Yeah, and there'll be some blonde bombshell on either Fox News or CNBC, and they'll say, yeah, we can just we're the United States. We can just create this money. Everything's going to be great. No other country can do this. And it's, oh my gosh.
And also getting back to your original introduction about the stock market. The stock market also it's like an organism. It's like a system that is supposed to, amongst other things, help facilitate the formation of capital available for the growth of new companies. And we've moved so far from that being one of the core goals of the stock market. It's just loopy.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a little bit about this word has come up in our discussion so far tonight, and I was prepared to kind of explain it to people a little bit, and you can qualify what I say after I finish this. But I think we need to kind of explain to people what deflation is, and I'm going to start by explaining what leveraging is, because then when you understand leveraging completely, you'll understand how it works. When there's inflation, it works for you, and when there's deflation, it wipes you out. Let's start with a leveraging example of a home. A good example of leveraging is a home loan. Nobody goes out and pays cash for a home anymore unless you win lottery or something. You get a mortgage and you pay a certain amount down, usually about 20%. And then you get a mortgage for the balance over 15 to 30 years, depending on what you want your payment to be and all that, and how much you actually want to pay out. So let's just use an example of a home that was started out at $100,000 because it makes the math really easy for everybody. 20% would represent $20,000. Now, you've purchased the house and you put your $20,000 down. You borrowed $80,000. Over the next year, it increases in value by 2%. That would mean now it's worth $102,000. But you only invested $20,000. So you've gotten a $2,000 increase on a $20,000 investment. In other words, even though the house only went up by 2%, you got a 10% increase on your investment. So that's the power of leveraging. And when there's some inflation, the price inflation that made the house go up by 2%, you're kind of cashing in on that. Well, people in financial circles, they know this. It's not rocket science for them at all. It's just kind of one of the first things they learn. And eventually someone says, well, what happens if we put $2 down instead of $20,000 and we buy 100 homes? Or in my example that I wrote out for myself, we purchased 20 homes with the $20,000. So we put $1,000 on each one. That would be a little more realistic, although I doubt too many banks would let you do that. That'd be a 99% loan. And this is why they won't, because now a 2% increase in the home, it goes to $102,000. Well, that's going to be still a 2% increase in the value of the house. But each house that you have, all 20 of them are going up by 2% due to the debasement of the currency. And so you would get 20 times that 2,000, or about 400,000, I believe. Anyway, it's a 200% increase in your investment. Well, that's a much better rate of return than 10%. But here's what happens. Because you only have $1,000 worth of equity in these houses, if it goes down by just 1% in value, which could happen if you start to have a recession and things begin to contract or deflate, as we call it, if it goes down by just 1%, now all of a sudden you're on the brink of bankruptcy, basically, because you have lost your equity in every single one of those 20 houses. And if it goes down even 0.1%, you are wiped out. Well, that's what happened during our housing crisis, 2007, 2008, and it was multiplied many times just because of the derivatives and how they leveraged the derivatives that were leveraging the mortgages that were leveraged. And it was just compounded many, many, many times, and it destroyed a lot of wealth that was created on paper, and it was easy come, easy go.
And the individuals who are owning a house or two, feeling that hit, it hits their net worth. And the mortgage-backed security sausage aggregation that they did with these products, the individual mortgages were all bundled together, and they theorized that if you're talking about a security product, a mortgage-backed security that is derived or that is comprised of mortgage notes, in theory at least, another subject altogether. But anyway, they're comprised of mortgage notes from all over the country, that we've never had a real estate downturn across the country in a single period of time. They've always been regional. And so they took that rationale and with that justification got ratings from S&P and Moody's and so forth of AAA rating on these credits. And
because the value of the house will never go down. I mean,
exactly. And then here's where the story gets really interesting. Because they had the triple grade rating on these mortgage-backed security products, the investment banks, the Morgan Stanleys, Goldman Sachs, et cetera, of the world, went out and marketed this stuff to the heavens because it was considered quote-unquote safe. And when you have this AAA rating on these products, they were able to use leverage beyond the dreams of avarice. And the edifice that was built in terms of leverage within the investment banks themselves is what crashed the financial system itself. We had the real economy roll over because, mom and pop and their house just lost 20, 30, whatever % value or more. But in the financial system, the thing that freaked out Paulson and made him go to maybe Greg Walden, our sitting fifth most powerful congressman in the Republican Party in the United States House of Representatives, and who knows who else he may have been browbeating. He certainly was talking to Nancy Pelosi and put the fear of Jesus into her. But this is the way in which the mechanics of this leverage translated through the financial system and imploded it. The banks, once upon a time we had banks that maybe had leverage of 10 to 1, go out and make loans 10 times as much money as they've received in terms of deposits by grandma. Quaint financial system that we used to have in commercial, commercial banks. But, in the investment bank world with the firewall falling with the demise of Glass-Steagall, the commercial and investment banks basically got together and in a condition of total deregulation went crazy and built up the real estate bubble in the real economy with the actual ramifications that happened with the crash, but at the same time, too, within the financial institutions themselves. And that's why it was imperative per the interests of the banking industry to save itself. And they created this new bubble, and it's hollowed out the real economy even further because it basically is a gigantic malinvestment. And you've talked a lot about Austrian economics a lot with your audience, and so this is a textbook example of malinvestment.
Yeah, and it's just to see it more practically. It's malinvestment at almost every level of the economy. If you get down to the actual house building that was being created, there were a lot of resources that were being directed from other production into building refrigerators and electric wiring and milling timber and making concrete and all the different things that go into making a house, cabinets and siding and carpet and drapes, all that stuff.
Here's a great example that's relevant for a lot of people in your audience. We now have, $1.2 trillion outstanding in student loans, up from like $600 billion or something only, a decade ago.
Yeah.
It's a gigantic bubble, and what happened was that part of the process of trying to reflate everything wasn't just trying to save the banks, but, policymakers in Washington, D.C. came up with a great idea of trying to, let's just try to manage...
Let's solve unemployment by sending them all to college.
You got it. It doesn't explain the entire distortion in the unemployment statistics as ridiculous as they are, but it's a chunk of it.
Yeah.
And it's another bubble. It's a perfect example of malinvestment. So, unfortunately, we got a lot of new college grads and soon-to-be college grads that are basically sitting with a devalued degree.
They're coming out of college with a mortgage on a $500,000 home, basically.
Yeah.
With no home to show for it.
And here we are, basically witnessing these bright-eyed policymakers and stewards of our economy trying to push a new bubble to help create or to help save the system from the collapse of the previous bubble. It's another example of these things that is very near and dear to a lot of people, in the millennial generation.
Yeah.
People in their 50s went back to school just because they couldn't get unemployment, but they could, get a student loan because it was all subsidized. You can go into
right.
online universities or whatever loan. Just to get the money.
I don't have to pay for it. I can get a student loan.
Free money. Oh, God. And we were talking a moment ago, too, about fiscal stimulus and how they're going to respond to the next crash. Get ready. I mean, this is a good thing for a lot of people who have debt and student loans, but I fully expect that at least half or whatever of the level that has been created in student loans is actually going to be forgiven in one form or another, and they will tie it to some kind of community service, AmeriCorps kind of thing, or I don't know. They'll probably have some kind of litmus test where you have to do something
to make
as a good citizen.
Acceptable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to get too
to
far
give
away
it a
from
bogus.
Go ahead, Eric.
Sorry.
Just
to, give it the imprimatur of not being a free lunch. That's the PR packaging.
I didn't want to get too far away from just discussing how our present situation. We have an industry out there that is very highly leveraged, and I think they are trying everything they can to stop deflation because they know it will totally turn them upside down. And that, in my opinion, that's the Federal Reserve. They have virtually all this quantitative easing they've done has just increased their exposure to a deflationary period. I don't think they could withstand it. I think it would destroy the Federal Reserve. It's my own opinion.
Maybe a silver lining.
It might that might be something we could all jump up and down for and celebrate, but it would cause a little bit of chaos for a period of time. I mean, there's just no denying that, because the banking system is kind of ruled with an iron fist by the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department has they have a regulatory arm that serves the banking industry, but the regulations
the Federal Reserve technically is the chief regulator, and the thing about the Federal Reserve though is that it's a hybrid body, and half of it, or the more important portion of it, is the New York Fed and the other 12 regional banks. And the New York Fed right now operates what is basically the largest hedge fund in all of human history. And the entire balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is comprised of over $4.5 some odd trillion worth of securities. And, that's where the power of the Federal Reserve is in terms of managing the gears, the pipes that flow, the monetary, the juice of the economy. And that part of the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. And you don't have to take my word for it or read, G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island. All you have to do is, and I probably even shouldn't say something like this because they'll probably strike it from the website at some point, but the San Francisco Bank, the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, as the region, literally describes it as such on their own website. They freely admit and openly state that the 12 regional banks are privately owned and that they're controlled by the banks that are being regulated by the Federal Reserve.
Yes, and
the fox is in the chicken house.
That's right, and the bank robber now runs the bank.
Yes,
it's still the same descriptive noun, but it's a different kind of bank robber.
And in the
It's
final
the robber who was
analysis,
the bank.
the final analysis is that Congress could actually, do. They can revoke the charter of the Federal Reserve. We can go back, and that's happened many a time in our country. We go through these cycles of these privately controlled central banks that distort.
If you go back, I'd like to recommend anybody who's really interested in this. Murray Rothbard wrote a great book called "It was the History of Banking in the United States," and it's just fascinating. I thought, well, this is going to be a boring read. I was reading it for a subject I was trying to do some research on, and I just couldn't put it down. It was really fascinating. But the most prosperous time in this whole United States history, in terms of the growth of the economy and everything else, was after Andrew Jackson had vetoed the charter. They were going to renew the charter, and he vetoed the Congress's action, and they couldn't override the veto. So the second bank of the United States was their charter was canceled. And they had been formed after the first Bank of the United States had cheated everybody out of a bunch of money and had such a bad reputation. And people were a little smarter then than they are now because they didn't have fluoride in their water or something. But anyway, from that point forward, the United States government had no debt. There was no taxation. The government ran on a balanced budget every year. And this lasted for about 20 or 30 years. And it was just they couldn't afford to go to war because if they did, everybody had to pay something to support the war. So nobody wanted us to get involved in any wars. There was a huge growth in the American population economy. A lot of people coming in this country. There were jobs for everybody. They were begging for more immigrants because those people were great workers and they wanted to earn a living and to be able to keep what their work and their labor and their sweat off their brow was worth, and they didn't have to pay tax to some lord or some union or whatever. It was just a tremendous period of time to be in the United States, and that's when much of the unsettled lands were settled in the area on the eastern side of the Mississippi and some on the western side. Not so much on the western side. I think the Missouri, some in the Texas, Missouri area, where Arkansas. That part of the country, but further north, they were still kind of Indian territories, and it wasn't until after the Civil War that those got settled. But the infrastructure that was put in place during that period of time, that would just serve the country really well for the next 50 or 60 years, and it was amazing.
Yeah. It's hard to compare periods to periods to some extent because we had so much new bounty of resources and open land to exploit, etc. So, we did have the fertile soil upon which very profound growth can, in fact, go and move forward. But, the monetary aspect is definitely part of the story. The reason why the United States grew to be as powerful as it is, or as once was in that period, and that economic growth reflecting it, was the monetary system. Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill, and frankly, ever since his face was slapped on it, I'm sure he's been rolling in his grave.
I think so. Actually, he was mentored by his successor, which was it's my favorite president. I can't remember his name right now. I should have put that in my notes from the show. I don't.
John Quincy Adams?
No, it was this was let's see, when Jackson, and it was he's only one term, and he was actually mentored Jackson all the monetary stuff, and he had been mentored by Thomas Jefferson, and he was the only U.S. president that cannot have some kind of a trace back to, I think it's Cromwell, his ancestor.
You mean Jefferson not having the lineage?
No, not Jefferson.
Or Jackson.
The one after Jackson, it was, and supposedly the next guy that was supposed to be there after him was going to be Thomas Hart Benton, who didn't make it because the other party was able to get the next election, and then that kind of stopped that. And gradually they were able to undo all the good things that had been done in the meantime. But I'll find this name and I'll add it to the little note underneath my reposting of the show tonight. And so all of you that are curious who this guy was, is one of two presidents I really admire that nobody knows who they are. The other one was Grover Cleveland. Oh well. Anyway, this guy was amazing man. He was kind of rotund. I think a lot of people made fun of him because he was overweight, but
Yeah.
he was a very, very amazing, astute person. He had a lot of courage, and he really stood his ground, and he was responsible for a lot of the growth of this country, a lot more than a lot of other people get credit for it. And so I really admire him. Think that history has ignored him for a reason, because they don't want more of that kind. They want people to be asleep and not understand all those things. Oh gosh.
Well, we probably got
Go ahead
3
and
minutes
talk
left
for a
or
little
so.
bit. I'm going to look this up because I have to tell everybody who this was.
Okay. Well, probably the thing that a lot of people are thinking now, after hearing us blab for 57 some odd minutes, is, okay, guys, well, what does this all mean in terms of where we're going and where's our economy and the financial markets volatility that we've seen and whatnot? I mean, the thing to keep in mind when one looks at these kind of cycles and the end game scenarios that grow out of it is that they tend to be more like process events as opposed to single down days or single down weeks like 1987, where the Dow Jones Industrial Average sliced around something like 25% in a given week or in a month. It's likely that we're going to see a lot more high volatility in the financial markets and downdrafts over time in 2016 is kind of like the baseline scenario.
Wow.
That it's almost a given that, after all of these years since 2009, with all of the excesses that have been pushed into the system by the central bankers around the world trying to save the system, and the rollover of the economy that is now happening, that we can see, that the underpinning for financial asset prices staying where they are is just not there. So at some point, whatever the catalyst can be that changes the psychology of markets, we will see the markets tend to go down. And I think that as a base scenario that we're going to easily see, over the coming year, 20% or so sliced out of this S&P 500. Mark Faber just talked on CNBC, I think it was CNBC, and in any event, a day or two ago, and he was talking about his, exact same framing of this discussion in terms of base scenario, and he's saying, 20%, 40% could be the base scenario.
Yeah. By the way, I found that president. It was Martin Van Buren. He was an awesome man.
There you go. Yeah.
And the good news is, deflation could end this evil empire of the Federal Reserve. I guess in its election year, so probably isn't going to happen right away.
And who knows, if central bankers are using the word jubilee, man, things are really askew.
Yeah. So thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thank you.